When Christian called me to ask me if I'd participate in this panel, I got really excited because I think this is a really interesting issue and there are so many things to talk about. And my mind was racing and I ended up with like 173 images to show in 7 minutes, and I realized I had to kind of get my act together and really cut back. There's so much to say about this. And I think really that for me the issue, and I've spent most of my professional life reviewing drawings and plans for people and in the process of helping them get approvals to do things. And as you all know, there are lots of overlapping layers of review here, and all of the review jurisdictions bodies don't agree on things necessarily. So it's an interesting process. But I've come to think that the issue is not really whether something is contemporary or traditional or any particular style. It really is all about compatibility, and that's what we should be looking for, regardless of what the style of a building is. And as I was driving around looking at buildings recently and taking slides for this, what struck me is something I've always thought, but that Washington is not a horizontal city. And it just drives me nuts when I hear that. Washington is a low city, but it is made up of vertically oriented buildings. So it is basically a vertical city, at least for a century and a half, and that still continues today. We kind of lost our way in the mid-century, architecture generally and specifically here. And more recently, a lot of architects have sort of found their way back. Some never lost it, their sense of where they were. But I think the sense of Washington as a city is really important, and we need to try to maintain that while we're doing new good buildings. Most of the people who've been able to do this consistently happen to be local architects, because I think it's important to them. I think that architects from out of town don't always get this about our city, and we should think about that when people are selecting architects. But there are a lot of ways to design good new buildings. There are lots of things you have to consider when talking about compatibility, and you all know what they are, but like massing and height and size and materials and color and rhythm. But my fundamental bottom line issue is verticality. And I don't mean tall buildings, but that buildings have vertical elements. They're oriented in a vertical way, although we did see a slide earlier that made it was clear to me that just because you have vertical orientation doesn't mean it's a good building. But I think it's pretty often that if you go horizontally, it won't work, at least not here. Whoops, all right. So, I'm just going to run around the city and talk about buildings. I think this is a really interesting block on Massachusetts Avenue. It's a 1600 block of Mass Avenue. You have on the right an early 20th century house. In the middle, a really stunning 1961 building by Keyes, Lethbridge, and Condon. And then a later 1960s office building to the left. Three very different expressions, stylistic expressions, but somehow they all work together in their verticality. And this is in DuPont Circle. This is on 19th Street at the corner of 19th and Sunderland. A row of very typical late 19th century row houses. And of course, row houses are forced to be vertical by their lot size and configuration, but with vertical bays and so forth. And next to it, a late 1970s office building, which made an attempt, I think, to deal with material compatibility, but completely missed the mark in the arrangement of the parts. The horizontal windows really don't work, and those large columns are not helpful either. Across the street is another Keyes, Lethbridge, and Condon building from the late 60s that, again, different materials, but has a nice scale of the parts, and they're vertical. The buildings I'm showing you were not all reviewed. Some of them happened because good things sometimes happen, and some of them happened because they were reviewed and they were made to happen. Although both good and bad happened without review as well. This is a building on the northwest corner of 16th Street and K Street. it was a reskinning of an older building, but it is, and nobody reviewed it. It actually really nicely, I think, deals with both the material that is what Washington's all about. This is limestone, and it's vertical, and it sits really comfortably in the streetscape next to fairly tall apartment buildings from the early 20th century. And I guess to me, buildings that fit in their context and they're comfortable in their context is what we should be thinking about most of the time. And I was really happy to see 801 North Capitol Street, the Hartman Cox building, because I think that's a superb example of a new building, happens to be very traditional in design, that sits really well in its context. On the left is the Denreich building. It's a Gothic Revival office building, early. And then next to it is a refacing of a small building and a new, I think, 80s office building that, to me, totally misses the mark. These horizontal buildings, and you can stand on any corner downtown and see them, and they stand out glaringly. This, of course, is the famous or infamous Red Lion Row, a very early preservation battle, and what I hear often is that what's really bad about this project is that they didn't save the full, all of the buildings that are in the front there, in that front row of late 19th century buildings. They actually did save quite a lot of it, those buildings. This is not a facade project. But what to me is really unsuccessful about this project is the building behind it. I think this is an example of a situation where somebody thought that horizontal windows and so forth would make this building look low. Well, mostly it just makes it look totally out of place. It's been called all kinds of things. Beached whale comes to mind. And, you know, it's the whale's out of the water and it doesn't belong there, and this is not a successful thing. This building I will pick on because I have some responsibility for it. When I was a kid, and my second job actually, I was working for the Joint Committee on Landmarks, which is the predecessor for the Historic Preservation Review Board. And this is a new building. This is the back of the building on 19th Street, across from some of the buildings you saw earlier. The front of the building is on Connecticut Avenue. This is the kind of thing I think everybody needs to be aware of. This is the red brick Tootsie Roll columns of the 70s. It is an architectural fad, or was an architectural fad, like other things such as the pink granite buildings of the mid-80s to mid-90s and the unarticulated glass boxes of the 2000s that don't work here. And we need to be careful about that. I knew this wasn't right, but I couldn't do anything about it, or I lost my arguments. I did, oh, here it is. This is next to the DuPont Circle building, so you can see it in its context. And I think it's really, it does not add anything to the streetscape. This piece of the streetscape, if you can see the cursor here, is the Connecticut Avenue side of that building, which I think actually it's not perfect. The windows are wrong and it's too short. And actually the reason it's too short is the community opposition to this building said the community decided an 8-story building was okay and a 9-story building wasn't okay. But if you see this building next to this building and the DuPont Circle building, it doesn't make any sense. But it's an example of sort of design by opposition that I think is something that is not the best way to get a good building, but it's something many of us have to deal with on a regular basis. But this building, I think, fits really nicely in the streetscape. The new building here, of course, is the building with the glass roof, but it was the first building, new construction project that was reviewed under the new Historic Preservation Act in the city in 1979, and I think we did a pretty good job. It's not perfect, but the face of the building on the street is right, and you could drive down the street here and never see this building, which is not necessarily what architects want. But in the context of a historic district, I think this works pretty well. So there are lots of ways to achieve a building that works in a historic context. This is Mass Avenue, right near the mosque, and the building on the little peaked roof, pyramidal roof on the right, is part of the Turkish embassy. This was a new building. It was the second round of reviews. It was controversial, but I think it's very successful. It's a huge building, a lot of it underground. But what, this is Shalom Baranis, what he did was pay attention to the rhythm of the street, so that there are small ends of the building at the street line with the rest of it set back here, and there's a lot of it underground. And it fits really nicely into the streetscape. It's a handsome building on its own, but it fits in its context better than this one does across the street, which was built without that kind of consideration. I think contemporary design is great when it's done well. And I think, unfortunately, Washington has a dearth of really good contemporary design. I think this is a really nice building designed by KPF on it's 1800 block of Massachusetts Avenue. Glass buildings are not typical of Washington, although they're getting more typical. But and this was an early one. But what I think what works about it is the articulation of the facade, the scale of the pieces, and it works really well on the streetscape. It's a distinctive building in its own right, and you notice it when you're there, but it also is a really good neighbor. Another way to do, in the range of things, another way to do additions and even new construction can be seen here. This is the Kennedy Warren, 1931 apartment building on Connecticut Avenue, and of course the Hartman Cox addition, which was based on the original architect's drawings. It's a part of the building that never got built. I think this is extraordinarily handsome and successful. The Park Service would not approve this for tax credits, and I think that that's a whole other issue, but it's sort of too bad that people can't do things this way when they're doing them on the basis of at least something historic. Back to glass boxes. I think many of them are not particularly successful, as I said, because they're totally unarticulated. This building, it's an RTKL building it's the southeast corner of 18th Street and N Street, where the old Presbyterian Church used to be. It fronts on Connecticut Avenue. It's in a commercial context. Its zoning allows for a big building. But this is a box that has some scale and some articulation, and you can especially see that on N Street. It reflects the patterns of the lot. The lots on N Street, it's a residential street. It pays homage to the bays and breaks down the scale in a really nice way. And that it's next to 3-story 19th century row houses. So there's a size differential, but I think it's a really nice way to do this. And this is what I was going to talk about in the beginning. Because even though Washington is for me defined very much by vertically oriented masonry buildings, there are always the exceptions, and this is the ultimate plaid building. It's of course the Washington Hilton, 1965. It was designed by William Tabler, who's probably the most influential 20th century architect that nobody's ever heard of. He literally wrote the book on how to design hotels. And this is one of the very few mid-century, large-scale mid-century commercial buildings we have in the city. Most of our mid-century stuff is institutional or governmental. And I think this is actually a really important building. Again, this wonderful regular grid. And this building is on a huge site. It is vertical on the ends. An enormous site. And it creates its own context. It's sort of a special situation where you can do something totally different. Although if you're going to add to this building, you need to take into account what is important about this building. Sort of like adding a building in historic districts or adding to monumental buildings or whatever. And the obvious thing here is the form. This is the seagull. It's all about curves. I recently worked with Hani Hassan at Beyer Blunder Bell to get an addition to this building approved, which is all about curves as well. Different material. This is really, I love this shot because I love this model, but it's all about curves here. We figured out to us what was the essence of this building to start with, and how do you deal with that? I could go on, but I'm not going to. It's a really interesting question, and what I think really we should, as I said, focus on is not style, but what works in the individual set of circumstances and that the design is compatible and it's appropriate. It doesn't matter what stylistic expression it is. It's really about whether it fits in its site. And there are very few places in town, I think, that we can do things that are totally crazy and really wild and wonderful. And actually, Suman's idea of taking whole swaths of the city where there may be another use that's more appropriate than what's there now would be a really interesting way to look at significant architectural changes. I think we are limited in our monumental core, in our residential neighborhoods, because the character here is so strong, and that's what makes Washington special. But there certainly is room for really wonderful contemporary design. We don't have a lot of it, I think, and people are scared of it, but there's no reason not to do it, but it still has to work. Thank you.